If you refer to your bulletin, you will note that the scripture reading for this morning is Exodus 16, selected verses. I have been advised the selected verses are the entirety of Exodus 16. So with sincere apologies to Clayton, understanding that the guy or gal in the robe gives the sermon, hold on, we will get through Exodus 16. From Exodus. The whole congregation of the Israelites set out for Elim, and Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you've brought us out into this wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger." The Lord said to Moses, "I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them, whether they will follow my instruction or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it'll be twice as much as they gather on the other days." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and in the morning you shall see the glory of God, because he has heard your complaining against the Lord. For what are we that you complain against us?" And Moses said, "When the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening and your fill of bread in the morning, because the Lord has heard the complaining that you utter against him, what are we? Your complaining is not against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole congregation of the Israelites, draw near to the Lord, for he has heard your complaining." And as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the Israelites, they looked toward the wilderness, and the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. The Lord spoke to Moses and said, "I've heard the complaining of the Israelites. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God." In the evening, quails came up and covered the camp. And in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the surfaces of the wilderness was a fine, flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much of it as each of you needs, an omer to a person according to the number of persons, all providing for those in their own tents." I know, it's a long one. It's okay. The Israelites did so, some gathering more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, those who gathered much had nothing over, and those who gathered little had no shortage. They gathered as much as each of them needed. And Moses said to them, "Let no one leave any of it over until morning." But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and became foul. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning they gathered it, as much as each needed, but when the sun grew hot, it melted. On the sixth day they gathered twice as much food, 2 omers apiece. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you want to bake, and boil what you want to boil, and all that is left over put aside to be kept until morning." So they put it aside until morning, as Moses commanded them, and it did not become foul, and there were no worms in it. Thank goodness. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none." On the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather, and they found none. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and instructions? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you food for 2 days. Each of you stay where you are. Do not leave your place on the seventh day." So the people rested on the seventh day. The house of Israel called it manna. It was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Let an omer of it be kept throughout your generations, in order that they may see the food with which I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt." And Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it, and place it before the Lord to keep it throughout your generations." As the Lord commanded to Moses, so Aaron placed it before the covenant for safekeeping. The Israelites ate manna for 40 years until they came to a habitable land. They ate manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. By the way, an omer is a tenth of an ephah. This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning, First Christian Church. It's good to be with you today. How much is enough? In our lives, how much is enough? How much should be in our bank or retirement accounts? What position should we strive for on the corporate ladder? How many items do we need to purchase? And as a society, how many jobs do we need the economy to add this quarter? How much more land do we need cleared of forest? John D. Rockefeller supplies us with the answer that the dominant society in the U.S. agrees with. How much is enough? Just a little bit more. Just a little bit more money in those accounts. Just one position higher on the corporate ladder. Just the next item we're intending to purchase. And one more quarter of a good jobs report. Just another couple acres of forest. Just a little bit more. And then a little bit more each time after that. In our world, we've been taught that there is no such thing as enough. Our society is one of shopping, of click to buy, and same-day deliveries. It's built on the idea that we can individually and as a society consume without end, that we can consume without a halt to our appetites nor a limit. There is never enough because enough is a constantly moving goal, luring us into wanting more and more. We hear buy, buy, buy. We are told that we need more. We must buy this new product because it's going to change our lives. Companies plan obsolescence into what they sell, a time when something should break, that way you have to go out and get the newer model. We have all collectively been a part of this world. In our scripture reading today, the Israelite people give us an insight that our problems are not new problems. The idea of never having enough seems to be a recurring problem with us humans, or at the very least, with us and our ancestors of faith. We begin a little bit after the Israelites have been freed from slavery in Egypt by God. As they come into the desert, they begin to complain against their leaders and God because the people are hungry. They are not trusting in the abundance God has promised them. So God reminds them how God's abundance is coming to them. There will be bread in the morning, and in the evening there will be meat from quail. Just enough for that day. And so we begin to observe a little bit of a pattern in the Scripture. God gives enough to the people to survive, even to flourish, but not enough for them to hoard. A limited abundance. Our scripture even makes it clear God is setting limits on what the people are given. And what do some of the people do? They act in such a way that they reject having enough to survive and to flourish. They say enough, in fact, isn't enough. They need some to hoard. We can only guess at their motivations, but we can maybe assume we aren't terribly different from them. And if that's the case, they might have thought they needed some because they didn't quite have faith that God was going to consistently give them enough every day. Maybe there's a day where God only gives half the manna and quail. Maybe they didn't trust their neighbors, and they thought maybe some of their neighbors might steal some of theirs if they forgot one day. Maybe they even started hoarding because they wanted a little bit more power. They wanted some extra resources so that way they could kind of have power over others as they decided who to distribute their extra resources to. Whatever their motivations, they did try to hoard, and God took away what was hoarded with worms. In the opposite direction, when the people did not gather enough before the Sabbath, this was not a problem with God's abundance being too limited, but a problem with the people not focusing their energies on accepting the abundance that God offered. God's limited abundance is enough whenever it is thought together. Now, we can deal with the elephant in the room. How can God's abundance be limited? Isn't it a little bit of an oxymoron? Aren't those kind of opposing one another? Well, abundance cannot be limited because then it isn't abundant, correct? Abundance means plenty far beyond our needs. Well, maybe not. We definitely have been told, the same as our ancestors of faith in the story, that that's what it is. We've been conditioned to believe that there's never enough for each of us individually. Perhaps one of the better known quotes from Mahatma Gandhi is that the world has enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. Meeting our needs is abundance. Meeting our never-ending wants turns into gluttony. In fact, it isn't just Gandhi with this understanding of the world, but the writer of Exodus who affirms this understanding as well at the beginning of our story today. The story is framed as God putting the people through a test to observe if they will indeed follow God's instructions. It's a test of the community's ability to make certain everyone has enough and no one has too little. God is testing if they can be a community, living together around their faith in God's generosity, God's limited abundance for them. We find this limited abundance laid out in other stories in our faith tradition as well. In the Garden of Eden, we find God who gives enough to provide for Adam and Eve's needs, but not for their want of the tree in the center of the garden. In the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus feeds the 5,000, all were filled because no one hoarded and ate so much that they took it away from the rest. Even Jesus, as the Messiah, is God giving the people everything that they needed, but not that warrior Messiah that they specifically wanted. God's abundance is limited for each of us, and that's good because God's abundance must be limited for there to be enough for everyone. For me, there's no clearer example of this than the challenges that we face with our natural world today. Challenges which directly influence us as well. Climate change certainly is the prevalent one we hear talked about a lot, and it is one with which I am deeply concerned, but creation itself faces other problems as well. There's pollution from chemicals, temporary, and as we're hearing recently, forever. Loss of biodiversity is another that comes from habitats being pushed back by either our wants for foods that shouldn't necessarily grow there or the clearing of land to further development. And then we also have the influx of invasive species as well. And these are issues caused by our failure to recognize the individual and collective limits of God's abundance in this creation in this world. Carbon dioxide and methane drive that climate change because we find convenience and travel very seductive. Chemical pollution is driven by our needs for quick fixes, from our fast food containers to our cookware that we want to not stick. Biodiversity loss arises from us hearing the question, how many more forest and prairies need to become farmland, and answering like Rockefeller with just a little bit more. Invasive species come from our failure to find beauty in the diversity we already have here, rather than needing to import flowers and plants that don't quite fit within our ecosystems. God's abundance is limited, and when we abuse the abundance we have been given and take it beyond its limits, other people and other parts of creation suffer because they no longer have enough. And that brings me to why I am here today. I am the minister and camp host at our regional church campgrounds, Camp Walter Scott, or as some of you who have been involved with it for a long time might remember it, the Walter Scott Camp and Learning Center. For those of you who haven't been there, I'm going to take you there very quickly. So if you want to go ahead. So we've got some pictures up here that'll go through kind of the campground. We lie in south central Illinois near Effingham on 180 acres of forest, field, and lake. There are buildings for people to stay and many other structures, but I really think the beauty of the place is in the outdoor chapels, like you saw on the picture up front with that cross at the beginning of the service. In our campfire rings, in our worship platforms, in our trails winding through the woods, and the secluded spots where trees have grown since before my great-grandparents were even born. There are smells of damp leaves constantly in the air because the forest likes to remain humid. And then there is also always a rustling breeze, there's always a rustling either from a breeze or from some skittering squirrels or some birds taking flight. And you can also often hear many places on the campground the lapping of water from our lake onto the shore. It's a place you can even taste with our new garden, where campers this summer have labored in it. They have helped to harvest peppers and tomatoes and other plants, potatoes, and then get to see those later that day on the salad bar and taste a little bit of the fruits of their labors. It's all sacred ground, as is all of creation, but it's recognized as being so much more from the experiences and encounters that thousands have had there over the years with our God. I just began my position at Walter Scott in January of this year, and though I've been attending in varying capacities for over 20 years, I want this to continue to be a place of abundance, but additionally a place where we can embrace an alternative way of life. I'm hoping we can show ways of living that reject a society that always says just a little bit more. We can set limits for ourselves that society does not. For example, we're no longer using general herbicides on the property. We recognize that by taking the time to pull a weed instead of spraying it, we can then throw it into our compost bin. And then once it's in our compost bin, it will provide some abundance to the soil that it becomes. And that abundance will pass from the soil into the plant that grows from it, and the vegetable that grows from that plant, and eventually into the campers who eat those vegetables. By limiting ourselves, we're actually increasing that abundance. Similarly, we've received a grant to restore native prairie along the front 1.5 acres of our property. It will look nice eventually, but it will also bring back biodiversity and to our forest and land that can't necessarily be sustained by our well-manicured and mowed lawn. This way of faith, limited abundance, goes from the broadness of creation to the specificity of people. Our main focus during the summer are our youth camps. I can remember a few years ago that we had a high school camp going on. And during a worship service, one of our campers who struggled with making friends was sitting by himself closer to the back of the service. Another camper who was quite popular was sitting with their regular group of friends when they noticed the camper who was alone. Without hesitation, that camper got up, left their group of friends, and went to sit with the camper who was alone. It was a small act. They didn't walk more than 10 steps, and it's not something that's necessarily uncommon at our camps. But it was a practical understanding of God's limited abundance. The camper with his friends realized that someone else did not have enough and gave up some of the extra they had, in this case, the time sitting next to the friends, to ensure that everyone had enough. God's abundance is limited because that is how everyone has enough. At the end of our scripture today, why I made us read all the way through the full chapter, Aaron is instructed to take a jar and put an omer of manna in it and place it before the Lord to be kept throughout the generations. This jar was placed before the covenant until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. And as we heard here, that wasn't going to be for another 40 years, a time after all those who remembered Egypt had died. That jar of manna before the covenant served as an instructional love letter of sorts, from the Israelites of the past to those yet to come. It told the story of God's limited abundance, of limits not placed to punish, but to allow all to flourish. That is how I envision our campgrounds. It is an instructional love letter from the saints that came before us and from those of us now to those who are yet to come. The experiences at Walter Scott are those of God's limited abundance, where what is taught is how a community oriented towards God's love can find abundance in making sure that no one has too little. God's abundance is limited, just like we are limited. We are finite beings living in a finite world. And yet, there is enough for each and every one of us. As one of my many, many favorite hymns from the Chalice Hymnal says, in this very room, there's quite enough love for all the world. For you see, when we choose enough over gluttony, when we choose to limit ourselves so that no one gets too little, when a camper chooses to leave their friends to sit with someone who is all alone, well, that is when God's limited abundance becomes limitless. Thanks be to God.